In today's lesson, we will solve quadratic equations by completing the square. First of all, let's look at perfect square trinomials. We're going to factor these perfect square trinomials first, and then we'll explain why they are perfect square trinomials. So in the first problem, it factors to be x plus 3 times x plus 3, and we're going to write the factored form like this. We're going to factor the next one, and we'll write the factored form like this. And then, of course, the last one is factored as such. Now, why are these perfect square trinomials? Because if we look at the trinomial first, the first term is a perfect square, the last is a perfect square. And then when we look at the factored form, if we multiply these two terms together and double it, we get 6x. If we multiply these two terms and then double them, we get negative 10x. And if we multiply these two terms and double them, we get 12x. So that is what makes each of these a perfect square trinomial. Now, sometimes we will want to get a perfect square trinomial. For instance, in this problem, x squared plus 14x plus, we have a missing constant term. We want to put in the right constant term so that this will become a perfect square trinomial. Now, let's go back and review standard form for a trinomial, ax squared plus bx plus c. We're going to concentrate on the b, which is always the coefficient for x. Now, in order to get this missing term, we will use the b from standard form. So, when we look at this problem, b is 14. To find the missing term, we want to take half of b and then square it. And that gives us 49. So our missing term here is 49. Again, we take half of b and square it. Now, if we factor this, what do we get? X plus 7 times x plus 7, and we write it like this. So we see now that we have a perfect square trinomial. Now, we're going to find the constant term or the third term of the trinomial in each of these. As you can see, the answers are written out to the side, but how do we get those answers? Again, to find the missing term, we take half of b and square it. So half of 20 is 2. Half of 20 is 10, and we take 10 and square it, and we get 100. In the next one, half of negative 4 squared gives us positive 4. And in the last one, we take half of 5 and we square it. We don't want to change 5 halves to the decimal 2.5. We want to leave it as a fraction, so we get 25 fourths. Now, we're moving on to solving quadratic equations by completing the square. So the process that we just did of taking half of b and squaring it is a process that we're going to use to solve quadratics by completing the square. So we see this equation, x squared plus 8x minus 20 equals 0. Step 1 says, move the constant term to the other side of the equation. So our constant term is negative 20. So to move it to the other side of the equation, we add 20 to both sides, and we get this. Step 2 says, now that we've moved the 20, we have a missing term here. So we must complete the square to find that missing term. Completing the square says take half of your b term, which is 8, and half of 8 is 4, and then we square it and get 16. So the missing term here and here is 16. So we want to make sure that we add that term to both sides. Now, step 3 says what we're going to do is factor the left side and simplify the right side. So when we factor it, we get x plus 4 times x plus 4 equals 36. And of course, we want to write x plus 4 as x plus 4 quantity squared equals 36. Now, once we factor, we're back to solving by square roots, which is what we've learned in a previous lesson. Remember, this was our original equation. So we take the square root of both sides, and then that will leave us with x plus 4 equals plus or minus 6. Next, we set up the two possibilities for our equation, and we solve. So we get x equals 2 or x equals negative 10. And as always, please do a check. Now, in our next example, we're solving a quadratic equation by completing the square, but notice that our a term is no longer 1. So when that happens, we have to do a little something different in the process. But step 1 stays the same. We're going to move that negative 12 to the other side by adding 12, and this is the result. Step 2 is where we normally complete the square, but we cannot complete the square if the number or coefficient for x squared is not a 1. So we have to do something to get rid of that 2. And what we're going to have to do is divide all of our terms by 2. And that will leave us with x squared minus 7/2 x equals 6. And I'm going to put the plus sign here and the plus sign here because we have to find that missing c term. Now we can complete the square. So completing the square again involves taking your b term, which is negative 7/2, and taking half of it. Well, taking half is the same as multiplying by a half. And so half of our b term is negative 7/4, and we square it, and we get 49/16. Now, that we add 49/16 to both sides. Now, once we do that, we can go on to step 3. And step 3 says, now you have a perfect square trinomial of x squared minus 7/2 x plus 49/16 equals 6 plus 49/16. So we're going to factor, and that will give us x minus 7/4 times x minus 7/4. And we're going to simplify the right side, and we get 145/16. Next, we're going to write this a little bit simpler so that we can prepare to solve by taking square roots. So we've factored the left side and we've simplified the right side. Now our next move is to then solve this quadratic by now taking the square root of both sides. So we're going to take the square root of both sides. And so that leaves us with x minus 7/4 equals plus or minus the square root of 145/4. Now we're going to write our two separate equations. X minus 7/4 equals positive square root of 145/4 x minus 7/4 equals negative square root of 145/4. And at this point, we add 7/4 to both sides, and that will give us our two solutions. And we don't want to write our solutions as decimals. We want to leave them in ratio form or in fraction form. Now, so we have solved a quadratic equation by completing the square when our A term is not 1. As always, please jot down any questions you may have, and during the next class session, we will get all of our questions answered.